Hello, I'm Michael Parker, and welcome to Antidote. Today we're going to continue our discussion into sovereignty over our own bodies. Should that not be an intrinsic human right in a free and civil society, including how we die? In June of this year, the California End-of-Life Option Act will go into effect. To explain what this is and how it works, I'm joined in the studio today by Joe Barnes. He is the California Outreach Manager for Compassion and Choices. Joe, welcome to Antidote.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael.
Thank you for coming on.
Sure.
So, like many people, I am just getting up to speed and learning about this. And in some of the issues, the episodes that we've done this year, we're talking about the importance here in the 21st century of talking about things that are maybe difficult and awkward for folks.
Sure. And
how we handle the end of life is certainly one of those things. So first of all, let's start off. Explain to us what ABX 215, the California End-of-Life Option, is.
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to come on and talk to you about compassion and choices and the work that we do in California. ABX 215, which is the End-of-Life Option Act, was signed into law by Governor Brown on October the 5th. The effective date of the new law will actually be June 9th, where individuals will be able to, which they're already started having conversations with their doctors now, but if someone's been diagnosed with a terminal illness of 6 months or less to live, they would be able to access aid in dying if they meet the criteria after meeting with their doctor. So it's a process that they would have to adhere to. They would start off by meeting with their doctor to discuss their terminal illness, and a physician would actually start the process of engaging them on all end-of-life options. And Compassion and Choices, we fully support hospice, palliative care, but also the expanded option of aid in dying, which is now the new law.
These aid in dying laws, this is not the first time that it's been brought up within the California legislature. I believe it's like 8 or 10 times.
Great question. Remarkable enough, the polling data, which highlights all of California, is the majority who support aid in dying. We've seen Catholics or all different religious groups and just individuals who live in the state who are very supportive of aid in dying for years have always voiced their concern about why aid in dying is not an option in the state. Well, we launched a campaign for the End-of-Life Option Act a little bit over a year ago, and from that campaign we ended up with legislation and we ended up supporting the legislation that was introduced by legislators, which is ABX 215, the End-of-Life Option Act. So we're very excited that individuals who are suffering from terminal illnesses will finally have an expanded option to be able to make a choice based on their own end-of-life care needs, the option of aid in dying starting in June by initiating the conversations with their doctors.
For people who may not be familiar with this, they may remember the story of Brittany Maynard.
Yes.
And Brittany Maynard was a young woman, I believe she was 29 years old, and she had brain cancer, and she formed an alliance with you guys and really brought a lot of attention to this issue.
No, you're so right. And I remember just from over the last year, from being out in the community and people just walking up to us at local farmers markets, and we were just having conversations about supporting the bill. Everyone was so touched by Brittany's story, but also the fact that, and people were very concerned that she had to move all the way to Oregon and didn't have the option to access aid in dying right here in California, which was where she was originally from. So we find that Brittany's story, which has been so powerful, has also ignited the discussion even further among California residents about why it's so important to have access to aid in dying. And June 9th, individuals who've been diagnosed with a terminal illness, that is, it was 6 months or less to live and they're mentally capable, will finally have the option to see if they meet that criteria to qualify for aid in dying. So Brittany's story has been a very touching story for California residents across the board on so many levels.
You mentioned Oregon, where she had to move. So which states have aid in dying laws currently? Yeah,
right now we have about 5 states that have aid in dying, California being one of the newest ones. Oregon, which is, it's been, aid in dying has been I think available in the state for over 18 years now. We also have Vermont. I believe Montana, and I feel like I'm leaving out another one of my
Washington,
states.
I believe.
Washington is a state that has aid in dying as well. And Oregon for us is that we've learned so many best practices from Oregon, whereas it really helped us to be able to craft the legislation here in California to actually put forth legislation for aid in dying in this state. And so the Oregon model, which has been in place for over 18 years, has been a very successful model to help us understand how we can draft up language here in California to eventually have a bill for California. But we ended up having the legislator who actually stepped up, and they had a chance to take a look at the Oregon model and said, this is something that we can do in California. They introduced ABX 215, the End of Life Option Act.
Well, let's talk about how this works, because towards the end of the show, we're going to allow those who are not on board with this. We're going to talk about some of the people who don't like it and why. But before we do that, let's talk about how this works. In order to do this, you have to be what they call a qualified individual. So let's talk about some of the steps that you have to go through in order to prove that you are a qualified individual within the state of California.
Sure. Well, first step is an individual, we're constantly encouraging folks to do this. Start having conversations with your doctor. And so an individual is in their doctor's office, and that individual receives that horrifying bad news from their doctor that they've been diagnosed with a terminal illness and they have 6 months or less to live. Well, now, based on the law, the doctor will tell them about all, procedures that are available to help expand their life, but also go over all end-of-life options that are available, such as hospice, palliative care, and then also aid in dying. If an individual feels that they want to seek aid in dying, then they have to go through a process of the doctor has to determine that they're mentally capable. Another physician has to come in, a consulting physician, to determine that they've actually been diagnosed with a terminal illness and they have about 6 months or less to live. And then there's also the process of 2 oral requests and then also a written request as well, which is separated by a 15-day separation part. An individual at any time can decide that they do not want to continue with this process to access aid in dying. We've actually found in Oregon that a lot of individuals who actually requested for aid in dying never actually took the medication, but it provided peace of mind knowing that if the pain ever became so unbearable, that they can actually take the medication to access aid in dying and have, death with dignity at the end versus suffering and pain. So it's very important that individuals know that this option is now available in California, effective June 9th.
Well, it's interesting to me because the way that this works, and we're also going to explain how it works in a moment,
Sure.
But yes, this is not something that people take lightly. You can't, fire off an email and get access to this prescription. I mean, you have to, you've got 2 oral requests, you've got a written request, 2 doctors must be involved, one to make the prescription, the second to verify the diagnosis and prognosis. You have to be 6 months, it can't be a year, it can't be 5 years. You have, there's a lot of hoops that you have to get through in order for this to work. So it's not something taken lightly.
And I'm so glad you mentioned that, Michael. And what I was alluding to is that there are safeguards in place that if someone has been diagnosed with a terminal illness or 6 months or less to live, they have to be mentally capable. They have to meet the criteria. So there's a whole process in place. And just to make sure that there's no incidents of abuse, a family member cannot make the request for an individual. A family member cannot sit in a room with the individual who's making the request and say that my grandmother or my sister wants to access aid in dying. At that point, the doctor would actually ask the family member to leave the room and have an individual conversation with the individual to see, is this something that they truly want to do? So it has to be an individual making the request for aid in dying. And then they have to go through the process. We anticipate the process will take a number of weeks, and it could be a shorter process to have access to aid in dying if the healthcare system that they're in is supportive of aid in dying as well. But we do anticipate that it's a process, not only for a person to meet the criteria to have access to aid in dying, but just making sure that they can go through that entire process as well.
Well, also, I know we did a news story here this past week regarding the changes in Canada, and this idea of death tourism, at least here in California, that's not going to be possible because you are going to have to prove that you're a California citizen, you've got a driver's license, you're registered to vote. Let's move on to, you mentioned the 3 requests. Okay, how this works. The drugs that are prescribed, it's a barbiturate, I guess.
Yes, and the other thing too, within the bill itself, it doesn't specifically say what the medication will be. However, what we know in Oregon is what medication was actually utilized, and we can anticipate that that medication would probably end up being the medication for in California. But that will be determined by the individual's physician when that individual is making that request for aid in dying. The bill specifically outlines a person must be 18 years or older. They must be a resident in the state. So those safeguards are in place right there for California residents. So it's not just individuals who just be flying into California to have access to aid in dying. A person has to be a resident in the state of California.
What I've read is that, interestingly enough, so a physician does not have to be present at the time of death. Is that right?
Yes,
Okay.
and so the way it works is that if an individual has already accessed aid in dying, and they have the medication and they self-administer the medication, 48 hours prior to taking the medication, there's a form that they have to fill out, and that form has to be delivered to the physician for the patient's records. When an individual passes away from taking aid in dying, there's 2 things. There's one or the other that can be listed on the death certificate. It can say the person accessed the end-of-life option, or it can just outline the individual disease that caused the person's death. So those are the 2 distinct components that are listed, one or the other, on a person's death certificate. But an individual can self-administer, take the medication, and I would anticipate most people, would want to be surrounded by loved ones or dear friends and be able to take medication and have a peaceful end. My dad actually would really inspire me to really want to be out here helping to educate the public. My dad was in a coma for 13 days and he had a horrible death. And he didn't have the option to be able to decide whether or not he wanted to access aid in dying or not. But I think that every individual should have that option to decide based on their own beliefs and how, what their feelings are, whether or not they want to have access to aid in dying.
I'm glad you brought that up because one of the questions I was going to ask you was how you became involved in this work.
Sure, that's a great question, and it's very dear to my heart. My dad was diagnosed with a terminal illness some time ago. He had stage 4 colon cancer. It spread to his brain. And I remember the last time sitting with my dad and we were talking, and he just finished having surgery and he had staples all on his head. And he talked about how he never wanted to go back to a hospital, if he just wanted to have the option to die at home. And he just talked about the excruciating pain from his terminal illness. And lo and behold, my dad, when he went to sleep, my mom, who's a retired nurse, went to wake him up to give him medication. And, he wouldn't wake up and he slipped into a light coma. And then eventually went into a deep coma, and he had hemorrhaging in his brain. And he actually, if he would have ever woke up again, he would have been in a vegetative state. And he made it very clear that he never wanted to die in a hospital, in an ICU or palliative care unit. But the only option that he had was we were able to move him from ICU to the palliative care, where he eventually was able to pass on and die. But he made it very clear. He said that if anything happened to him, he just wanted to die at home. And I think there's a lot of individuals who could probably relate to my dad's story that, they would want to have an option to die at home, maybe surrounded by loved ones. And if the option of aid in dying would have been available, that's something my dad could have considered. He could have made that choice to say, well, I think that I want to access aid in dying and not have to suffer. And so he had a pretty horrible death. That's not how he wanted to die. And I find going around the state of California, there's so many individuals who have loved ones or individuals who are facing their own terminal illness want to have that option. And we're thankful that Governor Brown signed the bill. In June 9th, individuals will finally have the option of aid in dying.
Well, you bring up an interesting point because one of the things that I saw that and I can't find it, of course, because I've got so many notes, but one of the things that stuck out in my mind is that in order to do this, you must be able to self-administer the prescription. So for those, I'll make an example. Let's say we've got a person who is mentally functional, but physically unfunctional. So let's say the person, the body's completely shut down, or they're quadriplegic or something, but their mind is functional. They are not going to be able to do this.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I hear the similar questions all around. And the bill is very specific to the point of an individual have to be able to self-administer. In Oregon, self-administer is also defined by chew and swallow. Here in California, individual has to be able to self-take the medication based on the End of Life Option Act. So if you're mentally capable and you have the ability to self-administer the medication, a person would be able to have access and aid in dying. We know that a lot of people are not going to qualify for aid in dying just based on the criteria itself. Similar to someone who may have dementia. I've heard individuals come up to me in meetings, presentations to the community, and they'll directly say, can I put this in a written request to my doctor or a loved one that if I ever, do not have the function of my arms or legs, or I lose my mental capacity, would I be able to access aid in dying? And the bill is very specific. The law, you have to be mentally capable and to be able to self-administer the medication. So it can't be your doctor giving you the medication. An individual has to be able to do that on their own.
This medication, is this a liquid? Is it a tablet? What is it?
Yeah.
What form?
That's a great question. In Oregon, we know that it's, I believe it's a Setonol. I'm saying it wrong, actually. It's
Seconol, I think.
Seconol, sorry,
Yep.
Seconol. And it's kind of like a mixture of, an individual would mix that up, kind of like a cocktail, to be able to take that medication. In California, since the End of Life Option Act bill was signed into law on October 5th, being that the effective date is June 9th, the bill itself doesn't specifically say what the medication will be, but we can anticipate an individual doctor who is going to be meeting with that individual patient based on their body and based on their needs would determine which medication would probably be best to have someone access aid in dying. But we're waiting to see what the medication would be for here in California.
Well, this is a side story, but one of the things that drew me to this story, and this is unfortunate, again, it's a pharmaceutical company, but the two drugs that I've read that are largely used are Nembutal and Seconol. And there was a story in the Seattle Times that recently they had doubled the price of the drug, Seconol, I believe it was. Yeah. And so a compounding pharmacist came up with their own version of this for people to use, which is a shame. Of course, the drug company claimed that, the fact that this is becoming legal in California is absolutely not the reason that we raised the price. It's just what we did. Sure. But the way that I read that the drugs work is that it can take anywhere from a minute to like 40 minutes usually for this to kick in. So the person can die almost within a minute. Sometimes it takes a couple of days. Is that true?
No, what I'm hearing is that individuals, after they take the medication, usually passed on in a few minutes, and they end up having, it's like falling asleep and having a very peaceful death, and then they're suffering and pain. I haven't heard of any incidents of abuse or any incidents of someone taking medication and it taking days or months for them to pass away from aid in dying drugs. The medication in Oregon, individuals in Brittany, which is very public, she accessed aid in dying, and she ended up passing on and have a very peaceful death. Yeah.
Well, let's address some of the people that are against this, and we want to honor that. So we're going to talk about some of the reasons that people oppose this. For doctors, there's the first thing, which is, it goes against the Hippocratic Oath. But one of the things that I keep seeing a lot is that people fear this is a slippery slope. And that as a medical option, it's going to look like the least expensive one. So in many cases, people are going to try to use that. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I find it quite different on the ground when you're talking to the general public. Whereas I find that a lot of family members and just individuals have said to me over the last year and a half while we're educating the public about the possibility of passing the law, that they talked about seeing their loved ones suffer in excruciating pain. Or I've ran into physicians and healthcare providers who said that I have so many patients that come across my office and I've given them a diagnosis of a terminal illness, but I haven't been able to help them because there's no law in place. And we've also found from polling data that a poll that was taken that doctors talked about how would they want to die. Mm-hmm. And a majority of doctors said they wouldn't want to suffer the way their patients suffered. They would want to have access to aid in dying for themselves. So we're finding that more people, when they learn about not just the importance of hospice and palliative care, but also this expanded option of aid in dying as being an option now, they can assess, is this something for them? And we're finding that, based on the polling data, the majority of Californians are supportive of aid in dying as an expanded option for end of life. And so that's pretty much why the bill was passed in California, why the governor signed it into law. And we noticed from just talking to the public in general, the majority of Californians from the polling data support aid in dying.
Well, I tend to agree with this, and the big thing to me, and the reason I want to bring up these particular types of subjects about the sovereignty of the human body is that, listen, if the government owns your body, then you're not free. And when people talk about the fact that, or the idea that some people are going to be abused, the way the law is written makes it, I think, much more difficult for anyone to influence some person to do this. It's like, listen, I understand the argument of the person who says, I have 6 months to live. It is going to get worse and worse and worse. Not only is it going to get worse for me, it's going to get worse for my family. And they're going to watch all this. It's going to cost us a lot of money. I would rather not go through this horrible exit. And the way the law is written, that individual has to confirm that this is what they want to do. So the argument that people are going to be influenced, listen, you're not going to be able to help that all the time, I don't think. Mm-hmm. But I think the way the law is written at least makes it less likely that that would happen.
Yeah, and then we also know from Oregon, from the data that shows that a majority of just deaths in general, it's a small, very small percentage of people who've actually accessed aid in dying that will be equated to dying from aid in dying. Mm-hmm. Whereas there's people that die in general every year from various illnesses. But for California, we anticipate, based on the population size and from the polling data of people who are supportive of aid in dying, you'll probably end up with a lot of people who may access the prescription, mm-hmm. but also just never take it. But it will provide some comfort knowing that if the pain ever becomes excruciating or if they're really suffering, they can go ahead and fill the prescription to have access to aid in dying here in California. So it's very fascinating that people in California, when you just talk to them about end of life options, and the majority of people just naturally say, yeah, if I'm diagnosed with a terminal illness, if I'm in excruciating pain, I would want to have the option. But then I also run into people who say, well, I'm not too clear about if I want the option, but I wouldn't want to stand in anybody else's way from having the option themselves. And so I find that, and Governor Brown made it very clear as well when he signed the bill into law, he wouldn't want to prevent anyone else from having that option to access an aid in dying if they choose to.
Oftentimes when changes occur within the U.S., a lot of times it happens in California or the western states
Yes.
first. So what are you guys thinking moving forward?
Yes, a great question. So we've launched the Access campaign, and we also have a bilingual campaign that's tied in with our Access campaign. And Compassionate Choices, our big focus is making sure that all of Californians know about this expanded end-of-life option that's now available. Because most people might be familiar with hospice, but we want to make sure that, not only people know that Compassionate Choices supports hospice, palliative care, but also aid in dying, which is medical aid in dying, which is now the End-of-Life Option Act. So we're educating the public. We're doing a lot of community presentations. We're doing a tremendous amount of community forums, town halls. We're having our doctors who are advocates talk to other doctors. And also this weekend, which was just National Healthcare Decision Day, we were doing information on Facebook, sharing stories, and also posting content on Twitter about National Healthcare Decision Day to make sure people know about all of their end-of-life options that are available. And just some people might not be aware of it, Compassionate Choices, we've been around for about 30 years. We originated out of Santa Monica, California, and progressed and became a national organization. And we really focus on educating the public and working with folks to expand choice at the end of life. So not only do we have right now the End-of-Life Option Act, rather aid in dying is a law in 5 other states, but there's also campaigns in multiple states right now to expand to have medical aid in dying as well, so which is New York City, New Jersey, and other states as well are also advocating and within a campaign to have aid in dying.
Well, I think it's certainly it's an idea whose time has more than come. And you mentioned earlier that right now you guys are stretched pretty thin. I mean, you're having requests to do presentations everywhere.
Yes, we have a minimum of like 50 pending requests already for presentations to various organizations around the state. And we do a lot of education at public libraries. The community come out and we do community forums. We have groups that request us to come out, some hospices. We have doctors who request us to come out to talk about aid in dying. What we do know is, and what we're hopeful for by June 9th, that a lot of residents will know about healthcare systems that are supportive of aid in dying, because that's what the Access campaign is all about, educating the public. And we want to make sure that the public is aware of which healthcare systems are going to be supportive of their needs when it comes to access and aid in dying.
If I am a doctor and my patient comes into me, and even if I've been the doctor for them for a long time, and I know that they only have 6 months or less, and this is just a hypothetical, and they want to go through the steps of the application, can I still decline?
Yeah, it's based on the process itself. It's not mandatory for a doctor to write a prescription or participate with a patient's choice to provide them access to aid in dying. If an individual makes a request from their doctor and the doctor says, I don't think this is something that I feel comfortable with doing, well, the individual then has to engage the doctor to say, can you provide a referral to me within this healthcare system that I belong to so I can actually have access to aid in dying? And the doctor would provide a referral so they can see another physician within that healthcare system. We're finding healthcare systems that are supportive, and we know that some doctors may not be, or they just haven't had an opportunity to be educated about the new law. So we're doing a tremendous amount of trainings around the state for physicians to educate them about aid in dying, the new law. We're also educating healthcare systems, which consist of hospitals, hospices, so they can be aware of it. There's a new law in place as well. And we're finding a lot of hospices and healthcare systems are also introducing policies that reflect their support for their patients who might want to access aid in dying. We also know Kaiser North and Kaiser South is very supportive of aid in dying as well.
Well, I think that it's something, listen, I support it because here's the deal. Basically, what is happening here is now there's a way for people to do it, because in the past, listen, it's not going to stop the person who is in a life-threatening, debilitating situation. If they really want to get out, they will find a way. But now they have a way that can be done in a more delicate, more humane way, which I support.
No, and it's interesting, and we always make the distinction to make sure folks know we're talking about medical aid in dying.
Yes.
We're not talking about assisted suicide, whereas someone who commits suicide is someone who could have lived, but they might suffer from mental illness and choose to take their own life. Medical aid in dying is referencing a terminal ill person. There's no medication that can expand their life. They're dying, so they want to request medication towards the end of life if they've been, given a 6-month diagnosis of a terminal illness and they're mentally capable to take medication to end their suffering. So people who have been diagnosed with a terminal illness and access medical aid in dying, they want to live. But it's just no medication that's going to cure their illness. They're dying, so that's why they access aid in dying.
Well, the most interesting thing that I've learned through all this, and I heard it echoed in a interview with Brittany Maynard, is that, as you mentioned, some people get the drug. What happens is now in their control, and they don't end up using it. It just gives them the peace of mind. So,
Very so.
Joe, I appreciate you coming on here and
Thanks
explaining
for
this,
having me.
because
Sure.
it's a 21st century issue that we have to talk about as adults and move forward. If you have thoughts on this, pro or con, we'd love to hear from you below. If you like what we do here on Antidote, please share us with your family and friends. And until next week, you, me, every single one of us, we are the Antidote.